Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use the Poinsettia Bloom Die from Spellbinders. I've used this a few weeks ago for a video and I really loved it, but I wanted to see if I could add a little bit of extra dimension to it. So this is the card that we're going to create. We're going to do that poinsettia image, and I wanted to see if I did it on top of some Yupo with alcohol ink, if you would see the variation in ink color from the Yupo. Now, so my first layer, I'm doing this. Second layer, I'm just going to use regular cardstock, and you really don't see the difference. I just was curious if you would be able to see the color variation, because I thought it was really pretty, and I thought it would be pretty for this poinsettia, but you actually really don't see it. So if you're not into alcohol ink or alcohol ink on Yupo, don't worry, you can start with a regular piece of cardstock and you'll get the same result. So you're going to put the regular piece of cardstock or the alcohol ink, what I've done here. You're going to put some Sukwang on it, which is a double-sided, really strong adhesive, and then you're going to die cut it. And I put the die cut against the printed side of the tape. I'm going to be working on that side of it, and I always like to work on the side that I die cut, if possible, because I really like the rounded edges that dies create when you die cut with them. So I put it through my machine. I did put some extra shims there just because of the Yupo. It really didn't want to cut through, but I'm going to use my cutter bee scissors and I'm going to go against the cutting or along the cutting lines and cut out most of the detail. Now I'm going to cut off some of those berries and the extra leaves because we really don't need them, and it's going to make a little bit more sense later on. We'll still have that detail, but for the part we're doing at the beginning, we don't need that. This is just going to make the cutting lines a lot more easy and simple to follow along with, and it's just going to make the whole process easier, quicker. We don't need to take the time to cut out those details because we're not going to need them. Now I am cutting through this because I want to have the outer edge shape and I don't want all of that excess on here. What I'm going to do after this is I'm going to take some of that tape backing off and I'm going to put some really nice microfine glitter on there. And the original thought was that I was going to be able to see through that microfine glitter and see through that tape and be able to see the alcohol ink artwork underneath there. If you wanted to see that, what you'd have to do is just do some like paper piecing, that sort of thing. I think it would still work that way, but for this particular technique, it didn't actually, you don't see it. You see a little bit here before I put the glitter on top, but once the glitter is on it, you lose a lot of that color variation. When you're taking this tape backing off, you want to have some nice fine tipped tweezers that you have to hold closed. That way you can hold on to that tape backing while you're pulling it off. If you have the tweezers that you squeeze to open, they don't have enough pressure on them in order to be able to hold that tape backing, and it's just going to slip right out. So you definitely want some tweezers that you hold closed. Now I wanted to have a little bit of shading on this poinsettia, so I'm taking like a burgundy dark red Copic marker, and I'm just kind of flicking some color starting from the back of the, or the center of the petal, or where the petal goes behind another petal, and adding some shading. You could leave it like that, or you could take a blender Copic marker and you can blend that out. It works perfectly right over top of that glitter. Sometimes it does pull a little bit of that glitter off, but you can easily wipe it off. Now, before I put the color, the Copic on there, I took a little bit of that tape backing, and I always keep my excess tape backing to burnish that glitter right onto the tape. And what that does is it flattens the glitter and it just makes it a lot more sparkly, so you see it a lot more. It's also going to make it so that when you color it with Copics, you're going to pick up less of that glitter, more of it's going to stay on the tape. Some of it will still come up, but that's okay. You'll see that regularly between colors, I'm taking my blender pen and I'm swiping it on my scrap paper here. This is just to clean it off. Once I'm completely done with the flower, what I do is I scribble on that scrap paper until the ink runs completely clear. Now that that flower is done, I'm taking some gold cardstock, and this is a matte gold cardstock, and I'm die cutting that whole piece yet again. This time though, I'm only going to be using the outside parts, the foliage, the outline of the poinsettia. I'm not going to use any of those inside little petal bits. I do save them. I keep them in the package with the die, and at one point I'll do like a paper pieced thing and I'll inlay those poinsettia pieces because I think it would make a really nice card with it. So I don't waste them, but I don't need to use them for this particular card. So I've got my outline here, and then I'm going to take a piece of parchment paper and I'm going to match that outline with my poinsettia. First thing to do is take that whole outline and foliage backing off. So I've got a bunch of exposed tape here. And then I'm going to take this piece of parchment and cover about 2/3 of it. This way I only am working on 1/3 at a time. I can match up those leaves and the outlines, press them down, pull my parchment paper down and just line up a little bit more, and then just gradually do the whole piece like this. This way I don't have to worry about that tape sticking somewhere where I don't want it to before I'm ready for it. I'm using parchment here. You could also use wax paper. It would do the same thing. I want to use something that I can actually see through it. That's why I chose the parchment, because I want to be able to see that everything is lined up. Tuck that aside, and I'm going to emboss with a 3D embossing folder from Spellbinders. This is the Holly and Foliage embossing folder, and I'm doing it in my Big Shot. To get the stacking right, I have some sheets, 3 sheets of index stock folded in half that I just keep with my Spellbinders 3D embossing folders. I do mist that cardstock ahead of time before I emboss it, just to soften that paper up and let it go into those areas a little bit. So I'm tucking that aside to dry for a moment, and while that's drying, I'm taking some glossy accent, putting them on some of the berries and the center of the flower. Now in the end, I do cover that center of the flower, so it's not necessarily needed right now, but at this point I was still debating whether I should or not. So while those 2 pieces are drying, I'm putting the card base and I am putting that 3D embossed piece on there, and then I put an acrylic block on there to set that to dry, and I'm also drying the glossy accents on the flower. While that's drying, I'm doing this center part of the flower, and at this point still trying to decide whether it's going to work or not. I'm using regular cardstock this time, so you'll see at the end that it really doesn't matter if you use the Yupo with alcohol ink that I had at the beginning or the cardstock. You don't even see the difference. I'm cutting that same flower. This time I don't need to do a shim because the Yupo cuts differently than cardstock. Cardstock is much easier to cut. But I'm taking the backing off of just the center of the poinsettia petals. I want there to be some little bit of dimension difference between the outer petals and the inner petals. So I'm only taking the ones from the center. I'm repeating the same process. Once that backing is off, putting some microfine glitter on it, taking that backing piece or that extra tape backing piece and burnishing it, making sure it's nice and flat, brushing off any excess glitter. And then I take some like a silvery gold glitter that I have, and I'm going to put that in the center of the flower just for some variation. Doing the same step with the Copics, where I flick from the center and then use the blender pen to color and blend those colors out. It's a really easy technique, and that, because I'm using a Copic marker, it's alcohol based, it will dry just fine on the glitter. I've been told before that it works with Tombows as well, and I've tried it, and for weeks afterwards you can pick up ink off of that glitter because the glitter is not porous, so it doesn't work nearly the same. Copics work perfectly though, and within minutes that alcohol ink is completely evaporated and you can't lift up ink off of it, and the color stays much more vibrant than it would if it was a dye-based marker. Now I'm going to cut that outline part, and I'm cutting a smaller piece of gold here because I only need the center of that flower. I don't need to cut the entire piece out because I'm going to cut all that off anyways and toss it, so there's no point in wasting more cardstock than necessary. Once we have that cut, I'll take all those pieces right out of that die, and I'm going to cut any of the excess that's not necessary off. And I just do that with my Cutter Bee scissors. Any of these bits that I'm cutting off are going to go right into the garbage because they're kind of weird shaped pieces that I don't actually need. I keep checking with my original flower to make sure that I'm cutting off the right pieces though. I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally cutting off a petal that I wanted to keep. So better to have both of them nearby and double check before you cut something off that you don't actually want. Once I have the gold one cut, I'm going to do the same thing with my glitter poinsettia, and I'm just going to keep checking back with the gold poinsettia, making sure again that I'm cutting the right pieces off and that I'm not accidentally cutting something off that I want to keep. Once I have one completely cut out, it's a lot easier to double check and see exactly what it is that I want. And the cutter piece scissors go through this really easy. Just remember that we already die cut it, so most of it's already cut. There's just a little bit of cardstock that's hanging on. So it's really easy to die cut it, and it's also really easy to follow the lines. So these lines don't look like they're cut with scissors for the most part. They look like they're die cut because it was die cut. Now I can take that backing off and align it. Now I didn't use the parchment for this little bit because the piece is so much smaller, and it's much easier to align this smaller little bit than it was for the entire poinsettia. Now I'm taking those cutter bee scissors and I'm snipping where a petal goes underneath another petal. I'm going right along the die cut lines, and this way when I curve those petals with my fingers, I can kind of tuck that cut edge under the other one, and it'll look kind of like the petal is going underneath the other one. If I didn't do this, I wouldn't have enough cardstock to get as much dimension as I really would like to get on here. So I'm doing it so that I can get a little bit more dimension. You'd be able to bend the petals a little bit without doing those little cuts in there, but it makes it look a lot more natural by doing it than it would if you didn't, because there'd be an area that would have to stay completely flat. My glossy accents is all completely dried, so I'm gluing that big petal or that big poinsettia on the front of the card, and I'm going to let that glue dry for a moment. And while I'm doing that, I decided I wanted to stamp a Christmas sentiment in the center of, or in this, inside of the card. So I'm taking my Misti here and I'm aligning my stamp, and then I'm going to stamp it with some Lumberjack plaid distress ink. It was the closest red that I thought would match the poinsettia on the front. I'm going to stamp that a couple times just to get a nice crisp image. I typically wait to add sentiments to the inside of my cards until I know where they're going or who I'm sending it to. But because this is the Christmas one, a Christmas sentiment, I thought would be just fine, especially since I don't have an appropriate one to put on the front. And I just thought this would do as well. So because I have a red mat around the front, I decided to do that for this inside as well. Sometimes I will cheat a mat and I will use a Copic marker and just go around the outside edge. But I thought this would be a nice, it would be nice to have the two matching, the inside and the front. So when I put the center of that poinsettia on the card, I offset it a little bit. I wasn't realizing when I was doing that it was pretty much off screen. So you'll see it in a minute when I show you the finished card, but I offset it a little bit so it looks like there's more poinsettia petals to this flower than there actually is on the die design. And if you use glossy accents, make sure to tap the bottle and burp it. You want to make sure you can hear air coming out of the nozzle, and make sure that there's no glossy accents in that tip. That way you can avoid it getting clogged. I glued the center part on the inside of the card and then set them aside to dry for a little bit. And once it's done, I absolutely love how this card turned out. I love the fact that it looks like it has more petals than the actual die design. And I love the dimension that center gives to that whole poinsettia. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending the time here. Have a fantastic day.